All right, it's 9:01. Stephanie, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Good morning. All right. This is Andrew Place, Senior Advisor here at Maryland Department of Environment. I'd like to start and table a roll call here for the Energy Resilience and Efficiency Working Group. Stephanie, would you like to take the roll, please?
Yeah, of course. Starting first, Senator Katie Fry-Hester.
Good morning, this is Bridget O'Toole. Senator Hester is out of town, so I'll be here in her place today.
Thank you. Delegate Lori Charkoudian.
Yeah, I'm here. Good morning.
Andrew Place.
Present.
Landon Farrig. Maurice Simpson. Christine Zismadia.
Morning.
Carol Lane. Jeff Shaw.
Yes, good morning. I'm here.
Nancy Sopko.
Good morning.
And Mark Zuga.
Present. Good morning.
Thank you. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. All right. Cindy, would you like to start to work through our agenda, please?
Absolutely. We do have 2 people joining by phone, and just for meeting minutes purposes, can those 2 folks also say who they are and where they're calling from?
This is Richard Ort.
Richard from
Richard
DNR?
Ort with Department. Correct, with the phone number ending in 4660.
Good morning, Richard.
And good morning, Cindy. This is Matt Bernstein with PJM. I joined the audio via phone, just in case there are any connectivity problems. So that may be showing us my number. I don't know.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. If you're not a member but would like to introduce yourself, feel free to do so in the chat. And I'm going to get started. So for today, we are going to, this is the agenda for today. We're going to be giving a few general updates regarding the Maryland Climate Change Commission. This working group is a part of a Climate Change Commission that continues to have other working groups and other really exciting updates. And we added this to the agenda because we noticed that some folks are interested in kind of hearing what other groups are involved in. We're going to be talking and summarizing the results from the survey that we sent out. We're very, very thankful to everyone who submitted comments. It shaped the conversation today. It shaped how we are moving forward. So it's very important that you continue to be involved, and just very thankful that we have a lot of ground to cover. Then we're going to be talking about the role of distribution through a guest presentation by a member, Mark Suka from Potomac Edison of First Energy. Then we're going to hear from PJM around 9:40 or so. We'll be hearing from PJM and some recent FERC orders that could be relevant to our ongoing climate change work. Then we'll move into discussion, and then finally we'll have a few minutes for public comment.
Thank you, Cindy. And I'll just note that working group member Maurice Simpson has joined the call as well.
Thank you. So
this is Senator Katie Hester. I'm here also.
Good morning, Senator. So here we wanted to cover just a few high-level updates regarding the Climate Change Commission. One update is that in case you wanted to kind of keep abreast and check out what other groups, including the commission, is up to, there is a YouTube page. You can always check that out. These recordings, like the one from today, are being posted in the playlist. There's a new playlist just for this working group. There's also a playlist per working group. So if you wanted to check out the work of the mitigation working group, for example, you can do that. This year, there is an important question that group is looking at, which is how do we find funding for climate action. That group is evaluating that question, and there was a meeting that you can check out that talked about different bills with different approaches. And then what I really wanted to put in front of this group, however, is that we are going to be moving into draft recommendations for the consideration of the Climate Change Commission. So what that means is that we will be voting on recommendations during our next meeting, and between today and the 13th, we'll be honing in as staff on what your areas of interest are and what the draft recommendation should be. If you want to take a look at past reports, they are available on our Climate Change Commission website. And the commission dates are all here if you also wanted to join those meetings or public meetings. The next one will be July 23rd. There will also be one September 25th and November 14th. And just to kind of give you a overview of the types of items that the Climate Change Commission covers, one example is in April 23rd, there was a presentation on all the bills relating to climate that became law, or at the time were about to become law. This includes many bills that many of the members here are probably familiar with, so changes to empower, more support for offshore wind, support for networked geothermal, leading by example efforts for state facilities, virtual power plants. There's a lot of good work that went on thanks to the work of our General Assembly, thanks to the hard work of many different stakeholders this past legislative session, and this is a preview. Some of which does have implications for our work as we move forward with energy resilience and efficiency. So just kind of wanted to put this in front of everyone. These are just the latest climate laws that we can consider. So today we are talking about our survey. I'm going to be summarizing some of the main opportunities, challenges, themes that we heard from you guys in today's presentation. Sorry, excuse me. Then we will talk about, we're just having a discussion today, but between now and the next meeting, our staff, with the help of some of our summer interns, will be finalizing ideas for draft recommendations to then present to the Climate Change Commission for their voting. And that voting, again, if you look at the timeline for the Climate Change Commission, will likely occur in September. On August 13th, we will focus on that language, on any final refinements. Likely we'll just kind of vote collectively on those recommendations. You'll be hearing more from us over email regarding instructions for this process. And then moving forward, we'll be focusing more on the study aspects. A reminder to everyone here, during our first meeting, we had a presentation from our amazing folks at Johns Hopkins and how they're approaching the study and the types of questions and considerations that they have for the study. So we'll be starting to focus a little bit more on that as we move along. I did want to make sure I answered any question regarding process. Does anyone have any questions for this timeline?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm traveling this week, so I can't see the exact timeline, but from what you articulated, it seemed relatively quick. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, if the group really feels like we will be ready to have recommendations, you know, in less than 2 months, if that's what I heard.
We're working with the timeline of the commission. The timeline is always there. that is the focus of today's discussion, is to kind of hone in on some general themes. And that's the end of the agenda, is the discussion portion. The thinking is that we'll be honing in on some of the general areas of common interest, including Senator Hester. Very much thanks to your questions and your list, because it also helps shape some of the themes here. But really, we have to start honing in on draft language. So we're giving everyone 2 weeks, and the survey was meant to inform the development of draft recommendations. So thank you again to everyone who submitted that. Was that helpful?
I would love to hear from other working group members, but it seems like this is our third meeting. And last time we were trying to talk about what we were going to focus on. It still seems relatively fast for us to move into recommendations, but maybe it's just me. I don't know.
Yeah, and that
I
process will become clearer as we kind of go along. Yes, Delegate Charkoudian.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate Senator Hester's comments. It does feel like I have no idea what our recommendations might look like. I mean, it sounds like this is our timeline, and so it's what we need to deal with. But I do agree that it seems rather quick, because I have no idea now, what is it, about a month out from when we're going to be voting on these things, what they might possibly look like. But if this is what we have, I just would say, like, maybe it makes sense to look at what we have and what we can do. If we can't change the timeline, perhaps one of the recommendations might be that even after we submit the recommendations to the commission, that we keep working. You know, it might be that we end up deciding that we all need to keep working. If we have to submit something on the 13th or whenever, I'm trying to see what this says.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So that's not to.
It doesn't mean we stop our effort. I guess that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yes, absolutely. So this is not to stop further discussion or further evaluation. This is to hone in on, there's 2 deliverables. There's the recommendations process that occurs every year through the Climate Change Commission, and that's what I'm referring to. But then there's the ongoing discussions that will continue to happen every year. And then there's the study piece that I think Senator Hester and Delegate Charkoudian, you'll be able to still contribute, and we'll continue having that conversation. So I do think it'll become clearer as we go along, but this was just kind of meant to put it in front of everyone here that we are now moving into draft recommendations. And that's part of the reason why it's so important to submit responses for things like surveys, because it does help us move along. So I'll start kind of giving, that was a preview of the process for these next couple of months. And now we're moving into the areas of interest that we've heard thus far. So last meeting, we had a presentation on grid modernization efforts in Maryland from the Public Service Commission. And this was one of the slides that was included. You'll notice here that the energy ecosystem has different components. It has generation, transmission, PSC jurisdiction, and then there's PJM, FERC jurisdiction, and the role of distribution. For today's meeting, we are going to be just talking about those 2 items, is distribution and PJM's jurisdiction. But I did just want to kind of note that I did sense an interest in multiple systems, but just for today, we're just focused on those 2 for the presentation portion of the conversation. And then moving into the survey. So the purpose of the survey was to gather information on the interest areas of the members and to understand some common priorities for this working group. as well as to collaborate towards moving towards accomplishing some of our areas of interest. And that does include building off from the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022. So some general areas of opportunities and best practices that we heard from the survey include identifying very clearly where vulnerabilities lie. That includes knowing where the grid is vulnerable, identifying critical facilities and actions to address said vulnerabilities, ensuring communication during any potential outages. This can also include cost-effective electrification. That includes ground source heat pumps. That includes future planning and proactive investments based on forecast load rather than just reacting to customer demand. And then lastly, we heard a lot of interest in energy storage. And this could include defining the necessary ratio of storage to renewable energy generation by source to ensure maximum resiliency, and turning on DER and distribution assets by having more demand side participation done in a way that maximizes renewables and minimizes costs. And that could include considerations for things like microgrids and resiliency hubs that benefits low and moderate income communities. Then we also heard some potential expansion opportunities. We heard networked geothermal systems is something that could continue to grow, beginning with a pilot system. We heard that there's interest in community-wide approaches. That could mean things like community solar. And we heard interest in making it easier to identify solar site land for solar siting within Maryland, and perhaps making it even easier by having some sort of database. Challenges include finding the right alignment of incentives and regulations that will direct avoided costs into current investments, clean investments. We heard concern over severe weather events. We heard battery backups could be centrally managed rather than just rather than not being centrally managed. We heard addressing retirements could be done for existing generating facilities alongside reliability mechanisms. We heard that we want to be more resilient, self-sufficient, including through new generation. We heard that there's interest in shifting funding sources from ratepayer funds to taxpayer funds, or just finding new funding mechanisms. Then we heard more interest in ideal locations for siting clean energy, addressing increases in load in PJM's service territory, contributing to system planning due to increased connections and variable generation. And then just generally, we heard distribution and transmission needs, as well as understanding benefits regarding DER and rethinking how current policy relates to new gas infrastructure. This is just a summary of everything we heard. This will be provided to all the members here for further, if you wanted to check it out. But that concludes the summary portion of the survey. Now we will be moving into our first presentation from a member that represents the distribution role, Mark Suka from Potomac Edison.
Good morning, Cindy. Good morning, everybody. Cindy, were you going to run the presentation, or would you like me to do so?
You can do so.
Okay. Give me just a second then. You able to see our screen?
I'm not sure the sharing permissions will allow it, so I just pulled it up for you, Mark.
Okay. Thank you for that. Very much appreciate it. All right. Again, I'll give a quick introduction to myself and to Potomac Edison. First, I am currently an advisor for regulatory affairs for FirstEnergy in Maryland. I do apologize. I have a bit of a cold this morning, so if I sound a little bit off, that's what it is. The good news is we're not all together, so I can't give it to you this time at least. In the past, I've worked with Potomac Edison FirstEnergy about 15 years. Most of my career has been in engineering. That is my educational background. A licensed professional engineer in the state of Maryland. And again, that's where most of my work has been at Potomac Edison and FirstEnergy, mostly in the distribution area, but I have worked in our transmission control center as well. Go ahead to the next slide. I'll give a quick overview of FirstEnergy and Potomac Edison. I guess I have my agenda. So I'll do a quick introduction of FirstEnergy, Potomac Edison, and electric distribution companies in Maryland. A little bit on the current state of the distribution grid. Talk about the current rules for small generator interconnection, as well as how those are changing. I'm going to talk a bit about distribution system planning processes and advancements we have seen and will continue to see in the coming years. We'll talk a lot in this group about distributed energy resources, and particularly energy storage, to talk about how we interconnect those to the system, the benefits and challenges those produce, and just a little bit on distribution system resiliency. So with that, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about FirstEnergy. So FirstEnergy is a utility company that owns a handful of distribution companies in different states. As you can see, the colored territories are the areas that we serve in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey, and the smallest section of New York possible, just above the PA border. And then the gray lines across are all of our transmission lines, and then the dots are the generating plants. Only in West Virginia do we own generating plants, as it's the only state in our territory that has not gone through deregulation. However, in Maryland, as like the other states, the EDCs may own and operate transmission assets, as Potomac Edison does, but really want to focus on the distribution system for this presentation here. The key is that the EDCs, including Potomac Edison, are solely responsible for the reliability of the electric system within their territory. Those are the companies that are fulfilling that role. So if you go ahead to the next one, to show a snippet of Maryland. This is the different territories that the EDCs cover. Potomac Edison, again, is listed in our former parent company, Allegheny Power's name, is this teal section in Western Maryland. So we cover all of Frederick County, all of Washington, Allegheny, and Garrett counties, and then a small portion of Montgomery, Howard, and Carroll counties, as you can see there. You'll notice a couple little areas that are different colored. Those are municipal electric systems, Thurmont, Hagerstown, Williamsport, and then there is an electric cooperative out in Western Garrett County. So we serve those as a wholesale provider. Those municipal systems or co-ops serve the customers within those territories. Go ahead to the next one. So just a big overview of how the distribution grid historically has been planned and operates. This drawing on the right, which was able to get from EPRI, shows generally how it works, where you have generation typically on the transmission system. It's connected through large step-up transformers and then transmitted across and between states at high voltages up to 765 kW, typically on our system. And then once it gets to the local areas, it goes, through a step-down transformer, usually at a large substation, to voltages that you more commonly see along the main streets in your neighborhoods, both overhead and underground distribution facilities. And then those serve out to your house, where you do have individual small distribution transformers, such as, the can-looking devices that are up on a pole, or a large green box that you would see, in your front yard or within communities. Typically, the distribution systems are radial, and what that means is that there's typically one line going out from the substation out to feed houses. They're not typically connected or looped together as the transmission system typically is. And then also generally power flows from the substations to the load just in one direction. So in our drawing here, we have power coming from the substation step-down transformer directly out to the load. It doesn't typically connect to another area or come back. That's, again, historically how distribution systems have been designed, although that is changing. Because of that, power system components such as a voltage regulator, what a voltage regulator does is it sits out on the line. It's basically a small and they're still getting high enough voltage, similar to customers that are closer to the substation. Circuit breakers, which protect our lines. If there's anything like a tree or anything that gets into the line, they'll make sure that those lines are disconnected and made safe. Those devices are all typically designed for one-way power flow because that's how the system has typically gone. And then as we do our planning process, system improvements such as replacing the wires with larger size wires or transformers with larger transformers, those are typically caused by increases in load. So as there being more load connected to the system, our customers are using more. We typically have to increase our size of our facilities for those reasons. All right. Okay. So next, I want to talk a little bit about distributed energy resources and interconnection rules. I know PGM is going to be talking a little bit later about wholesale markets. This presentation is, again, completely focused on the retail markets that are managed by state. So the retail interconnections of small generators, those are managed by state regulations, and in this case, by Maryland regulations. Since the start of this process, rules have typically been what we call a cause or pays methodology. So what that means is if you are a developer of a renewable generating system and you want to connect into an EDC system, you pay the entire cost of grid upgrades. So if your system is going to require us to put in a new large transformer or to upsize our wires, you pay 100% of the cost of that upgrade, even if that upgrade is going to be larger than what you technically need. If it's the next wire size up is basically how it works, you would end up paying for the entire cost of those upgrades. That's the cause or pays methodology. Also, when we do these studies in the past, they started as what we call rules of thumb screen, where an engineer would look at, like an overall rule, such as, you wouldn't want to have more than, 20%, your generation on a circuit may not be more than 20% of the load. So again, those really high level type screens, because doing a detailed analysis was difficult at the time. And then whenever we needed to determine the actual costs and upgrades needed to add DER at each location, we would have to do detailed studies that would frankly take a long time and a lot of engineering work in order to make sure that those could be interconnected to the system safely. Some advancements, because this process has definitely modernized a lot, especially over the last decade. Some states, including Maryland, are moving to what was referred to as a beneficiary pays model. What this does is, in my example before, where if you want to connect something to the system and you need to have a large upgrade done, you would then only pay for the portion of the capacity that upgrade adds to the system. So if that upgrade allows maybe 3 large generators to connect to the system, you would only be paying for, let's say, a third of the cost. And then those that are going to be connecting later would make up for those additional costs. So it's allowed for those costs to be shared, so more projects and more locations can be viable. In addition, what we call power system analysis software has allowed for a lot more advanced modeling. So in the past, when an engineer would have to do a lot more work by hand, a lot more work specifically, we've got more advanced computer programs and modeling that allow us to do this much quicker. This definitely can allow for some advanced information on grid connections, but some limitations do exist. So I'll bring attention to, on the right side of the screen, what this map here is an example of the Potomac Edison hosting capacity map. Again, I represent PE, but all the utilities have similar maps. They are a little different in the way that they show the data, but they all show information, pretty much, the same idea. This is actually a snip of our territory near Deep Creek Lake in Garrett County. And each one of these dots is basically a point in which you could connect to our distribution system. These are lines, but basically in our system, this is perhaps where a transformer or where a branch is on our system. The green dots are ones where there is more capacity available, and the reds are less capacity available. If you're wondering the reason why there's a lot more red than there is green, typically the systems that go into the neighborhoods or into the streets are typically single phase systems. There's one conducting wire as opposed to three, and those are able to accommodate a little bit less. So if you're looking at putting in a large system, the green dots would give you a much better idea of the areas that would make more sense for you to start looking at land development. I do want to mention the limitations. This is a great tool for developers to look at, and does saw in the survey response kind of getting an idea of where it makes sense to connect new generation to the system. This definitely gives a good idea, but it is very important that the utility is still able to do a full interconnection study. These are advanced information that's done partially by our engineers and partially by computer software. The information definitely needs to be validated, needs to be brought up to date as of the instant in which the generator is asking to interconnect. So it's a good tool, but the requirement to do a full study still needs to remain. Then if you could go ahead. Okay. Going to talk quickly about some advancements to the distribution system planning processes. Quick overview. The utilities, all the utilities do their own processes a little differently, but overall they're relatively similar. What we do is our engineers will take a look at each one of our circuits and distribution transformers on a regular basis. So for example, we might be looking at a certain circuit and area every 5 years or every 3 years. And when we do those kind of reviews, we'll take a look at, what is the reality on that system today? Are there any issues with how the load is flowing today, with the amount of load on the system, with the voltages being served to customers? But then also do a look ahead, and that's the important part. We'll look ahead maybe in the short term, like in the next 12 months, also maybe in the next 5 years, next 10 years. The further out you get when you're looking at planning the system, the less certainty you have. So we know a lot better what's going to be connected to the system over the next 6 to 12 months. If we're looking out 5 to 10 years, we have to use a lot of different forecasting models to figure that out. So we may consider a steady load growth in an area. An area might be seeing a lot of new development. We might be seeing an area that sees potentially a lot of renewable energy development, which is going to also affect what's on that system in the future. So again, those models are important and continuing to be developed. I will mention that there is a work group at the Public Service Commission dedicated to distribution system planning that is going through a lot of these details and coming up with a process for each utility that acknowledges that each utility is going to do things a little differently, but also finding similarities to make sure that we are planning adequately for the future, as the future here is going to look definitely different than the recent past has. And then this top picture on the right is just I understand it's blurry, you can't see the details, but I wanted to point out this is an example of distribution system modeling software that is out there. So this is what our engineers would look at. They were able to model the system, run a simulated power flow under peak conditions or under any conditions, and kind of see where the violations might be if there are any, and then they can kind of ramp up the load into the future and say, hey, if this load progresses the way I expect it will over the next 5 to 10 years, the generation comes on that we expect, this is what it's going to look like, and can find those solutions in advance. One last thing, sorry, Cindy, one last thing to cover on that last slide is bidirectional power flow. So I mentioned before that typically our distribution systems have been managed in just one way. So the power flows from the substation out to the load. For a couple of reasons, a lot of the utilities have looked at bidirectional power flow. Here's an example of what we call a distribution automation system on the right, where what we have would have been 2 different distribution circuits that are tied together at one point. This is mainly a reliability solution, which would allow the power to flow, in both directions on the circuit. It won't kind of complete a loop at one time, but if there is an outage, if there is a fault on any section of line here, the power can be automatically redistributed to those other sections so that we limit the outage. There's still going to be some customers that are out, but we may only have 1 out of 3 sections or 1 out of 4 sections on a circuit that are out, as opposed to all of them. At the same time, that bidirectional flow is also needed to unlock more DER integration. So again, if we have large generators at the end, middle of our circuit, there is also a possibility that power can flow in the reverse direction back to the substation. Go back to some of the equipment that's been out on the system and is still operating. Some of those pieces of equipment are only made to operate in one direction. So sometimes those need to go be upgraded to be reprogrammed. Again, we need to do analysis to make sure that that works. But there is kind of an area where we can both get increased reliability, increased DER integration by making those circuits flow in both directions. Go ahead, Cindy. Okay, wanted to cover a bit on DER and energy storage specifically. So there are a couple initiatives at that PE and the other utilities are involved with at the Public Service Commission on energy storage. The first is the utilities have been engaged in a energy storage pilot program over the last few years. It's a total between all of the investor-owned utilities of about 8.5 megawatts. Those facilities are some of them are in service, some of them will be in service soon, but that group does provide a report to the General Assembly on the status of those pilot programs, and I'll cover one of PE's sites here in a second. The next larger initiative is the Maryland Energy Storage Initiative, which does have a target of 3,000 megawatts. So again, the scale is vastly different from 8.5 up to 3,000. This initiative is targeting incentivizing 3,000 megawatts by 2033. It does include all types of technology, including thermal, electrochemical, virtual power plants, hydrogen, and potentially others. And it is in earlier stages of development where we're looking at kind of what those programs within the initiative are going to look like and what those incentives are going to look like for people wanting to interconnect storage. I'll give a quick example of the picture on the right. This is the Potomac Edison Myersville Energy Storage System, which has been in service for about a year at this point. Just showing you what's in the picture. We have our EV in front here. There are 2 DC fast chargers on the right side. There's a level 2 charging station on the left side, so it is capable of charging 4 vehicles at the 2 different capacities there. Right behind that, there is the green box kind of right toward the middle is a distribution transformer and then switching equipment to the left of that. And then in the far back in a large C container is the energy storage system. So all the batteries sit in that system back there. The capacity, it's a 500 kW capacity battery with energy at 1.3 megawatt hours. Generally the goal here is that it limits the amount of capacity the fast chargers take from the system. So when you pull up and you're charging your vehicle, you're basically pulling from the battery as opposed to pulling from the grid. And then the battery can charge from the grid much more slowly over time to regenerate that. Of course, if the battery were to run out, then it would end up using the grid. But again, the idea is that it's sized so it generally does not have to pull from the grid. So we don't see as much of a demand spike when we do have charging there. So again, this is an example of benefits that storage can provide to the distribution system to try to level out those peaks. There are some challenges in integrating storage. One of those, is the last bullet there. If we're looking to utilize storage as a capacity resource. So again, when our engineers are planning the system, they could, instead of building a new circuit or upgrading a transformer, they could encourage energy storage to be installed or directly install energy storage on the system. But they need to be able to ensure that that storage is available at the exact time that they're going to need it. Again, for example, today, these are very high usage days on the electric system. Our operators and our engineers need to know that if they're counting on those energy storage resources for distribution system capacity, much different than generation capacity, but capacity on the distribution system, that they're going to be available at a very, very, very high factor, in order to be able to count on those resources being there. So that's kind of the biggest challenge I see there. And then the last, just since it is in the name of the work group here, did want to cover just a little bit on distribution system resiliency. Mostly we talk about that when we talk about our storm restoration process, but this could be expanded to any type of large disturbance on the system, whether it's caused by weather or other reasons. We have a large process to get everybody at the company engaged, as do all the other utilities. Our focus is first off is going to be on public safety, ensuring that our first responders have what they need in order to relieve any dangerous situations out in the field, and then get to those high priority calls. The biggest thing is collaboration with our state, county, and local officials. We have personnel that their job in those events is to work with those officials to make sure we understand what exactly they need, what facilities need to come back on first, where are any kind of major hazards in their areas, and that becomes our main focus as we start through the process. There is definitely potential to incorporate distributed energy resources in that process, including customer and utility owned microgrids. For example, if a customer has backup at their location, especially if it's a state, local, county customer, then that can kind of not be maybe as high of a priority to restore because they're able to keep their power on there, and we can focus our efforts elsewhere. The same thing could be done with utility-owned microgrids, but again, the important thing is that if we're going to count on those, then the utility needs to make sure we have the ability to control those. Finally, I just did want to mention there is a work group at the Public Service Commission that is discussing metrics on resiliency and potentially how resiliency programs can be evaluated, as well as some of the other things I talked about there as far as working with state, local, and county officials. So that is what I had for this presentation. Cindy, if there was any comments that came in or questions, I apologize, I did miss them, but I'm happy to have a discussion or answer any questions to the best of my ability.
We can have a few minutes for questions and comments. We did get a few comments from Delegate Charkoudian. Would you like to address those comments, Delegate?
Well, sure. I was just sort of comment as you were going through. I mean, I think that there's a couple of shifts that we need to make in the way that we're thinking about distribution system planning. And the first one, I think that's a challenge is, and I think you did a really good job of outlining how we've essentially built a grid for generation in one place going to usage in another place. And the entire grid, the distribution system grid, the transmission grid has been built that way. And now that we need to change the way that we do energy generation and distribution for a whole host of reasons, climate change, resiliency, and so on, the grid doesn't work for that. And so now we need to transform the grid. And I feel like you kind of laid that out really nicely. The one piece that I just wanted to highlight for folks to be thinking about as we're thinking about the work that we need to do from a policy perspective is that whether you talk about it as causer pays or beneficiary pays, both of those approaches don't consider the fact that when people put solar on their roof, it has benefits to the broader community. Now, you could argue that gets captured in net metering, but this broader idea that the distribution system, like one of the problems with the way that we've done distribution system planning and the way that I hear a lot of utilities talk about it is the DERs as a burden and a liability as opposed to an asset, even though it requires that we change our thinking around it in order to get that right. And so that means changing the way money flows and markets and all of those things. But I just think that that's a really important thing because I think we need to look at our language and how we think about what these distributed resources are, what the benefits are. And the benefits are not only to the person who puts it on their roof or in their yard or on their farm. So that was the first sort of comment. And if you want to speak to that, I'll just make the second comment and you may want to speak to either of them. The second thing that I just want to highlight from a policy perspective is that historically, and again, I think you said this, but if I could just add the public policy kind of side to it, historically distribution system planning has been done, and we assume that utilities are planning because they're building stuff and they're showing up with rate cases. And so there's some planning happening, but up until we really drive it from a public policy perspective, I think utilities have the ability to basically make those decisions. Certainly they're responsible for reliability in the bigger sense, but mostly they can make those decisions in ways that are beneficial primarily to shareholder returns. When we changed the policy a few years ago to say distribution system planning has to include state policy, and we're driving, hopefully, the Public Service Commission to require a level of transparency and input into distribution system planning. So while the assets are still owned by the utilities, we add more responsibility to the utilities and to the regulatory process to make sure that the way that planning is being done is supporting state policies, and the law that we passed lists some of the very specific policies that it needs to be planning for. So I just wanted to highlight those 2 points, and Marker, if anyone else wanted to sort of comment on it, because I think it reflects kind of an evolution in both how we think about DERs and how we think about distribution system planning. Yeah.
Thank you, Delegate Charkoudian. I would just say that you hit the points that the DSP group is actively working on right now, especially the transparency part of it. And my experience is the utilities have been open to additional transparency through that process, and tend to see a whole lot more of that. But
But with all due respect, Mark, that wasn't my experience when I was trying to get the bill through the General Assembly, but I look forward to keeping on working on that transparency with you.
absolutely.
I will quickly mention that there are other working groups, and on the 26th, there will be a Just Transition working group that will have a guest speaker that talks about current efforts to establish the geothermal pilot that was created due to the leadership of Delegate Charkoudian and the passage of the WARN Act. But we are now going to, if there's no other further last minute comments or questions for Mark, we are going to be moving to the PJM portion of the conversation. Matthew, are you with us?
Yeah, good morning, Cindy. Can you hear me?
Yes. Would you like me to pull up the slides?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind driving the presentation. And I don't know if it's maybe possible to zoom in a little bit.
I'm not sure how to do that. I'm sorry. I think this will work. Wasn't able to figure it out.
Okay, all right. And again, I'll just note that at the end of the presentation is my contact information. If anybody wants to follow up with any questions they're not able to address on this morning's call. Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Bernstein. I'm a senior policy advisor at PJM Interconnection within our governmental services team. Our group is responsible for engaging the states, public utility commissions, consumer advocates, legislative and governmental other governmental bodies within the PJM footprint on developments at the federal level and the state level as it interacts with PJM and the RTO dynamic. I'll also note that in the room with me is Jason Stanek, who previously served as the chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission. I believe you all are pretty familiar with Jason. So he's on the call as well. In addition, Stuart Whittam, who is our regulatory manager for the state of Maryland, as well as New Jersey, is on the call. So I'll be leading this presentation, but I also welcome them to hop in if there are any clarifying points or questions as we make our way through the content. So it's great to be with you all today for this presentation. I'll begin by providing just a little bit of an overview of PJM, our primary functions, some statistics indicating some of the trends we're seeing, and then I will get into an overview of several recent FERC orders that we believe are going to help facilitate renewables and other policies into the PJM system, the planning process and operations and markets participation. So FERC Order 1920 as well as FERC Order 2222, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Just to begin, the slide you see before you is an overview slide of PJM. So we are the regional transmission organization for all or part of 13 states within the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest, New Jersey, all the way out to ComEd in Northern Illinois, including Chicago, down through Central Kentucky, Virginia, and a little part of North Carolina, as well as everything in between. So all are part of 13 states. PJM does not own any equipment, generation, or transmission facilities within our footprint, but we do manage the flow of electrons within the footprint, kind of like an air traffic controller, but for the electric system. PJM operates as a private LLC. We're not for profit, but we do have over 1,000 members that engage in issues through an open and transparent stakeholder process. And again, as it relates to the state, we engage with our public service commissions, consumer advocates, legislative bodies, the executive branch, and other state agencies who are engaged within PJM matters as well. So just some brief high-level statistics there for you. Again, I'm not sure if this presentation will be shared after today's meeting, but I'm certainly willing to follow up if there are any questions regarding the information you see before you. Next slide, please. Okay, going into a little bit more detail about our three primary functions, transmission planning, you see there on the left. So again, we do not own any equipment, but we do plan a large component of the transmission system in coordination with our transmission owners, as well as merchant transmission developers to resolve reliability violations, enhance market efficiency on the system, and advance public policies as well. Grid operations, we have two control rooms at PJM, one at our Valley Forge campus up outside of Philadelphia, and another one about an hour north of that in Pennsylvania. And together, those operation rooms are staffed 24/7, and again, monitor the system and coordinate the flow of electrons across the entire system. And then finally, PJM administers wholesale electricity markets for our footprint. This includes real-time and day-ahead energy markets, capacity market to ensure that we have sufficient resources, not just today, but also years into the future. And then ancillary service markets to help support the function of the grid. We're able to have markets and price signals related to some of those services as well. Okay, so the next few slides, we're going to just talk about where things are today and then how they are transitioning into the future. So beginning with where we are today, we have this existing installed capacity slide. The figures you see before you, these are reflective of the capacity and accreditation that we rely on for resource adequacy. And the reason why I'm noting that is we do have an accreditation model that in certain circumstances can derate resources. So the numbers you see here before you are not necessarily reflective of the entire output of a facility. I'm particularly calling this or making a point of this as it relates to renewable resources. So the solar and wind figures you see there, there are higher nameplate capacity on the system. Some trends as it relates to the evolving capacity mix so far. We've natural gas serves as the most predominant fuel resource on the PJM footprint today. Over the last 10 to 15 years, that has replaced coal. We've seen over 30,000 megawatts of coal retire since 2010, and we are forecasting more retirements by the end of the decade as well. But we still have a sizable coal fleet on the system, as well as nuclear. Nuclear is about 18% of our installed capacity, but because it's such a high output and capacity factor, provides about a third of the energy on the PJM system. And then again, we have a small but growing number of renewable resources coming onto the system, and I'll cover that in a later slide. Real quick on the next slide, I want to just also highlight the existing installed capacity portfolio within the state of Maryland. This also includes DC because the PEPCO service territory covers DC. However, this generation is reflective of what's physically installed within the state of Maryland. So with nuclear, there's the Calvert Cliffs plant, a lot of natural gas, some coal from the Brandon Shores and Wagner units. However, those coal units have indicated their intent to deactivate in the coming years. So that number is going to be reducing and then eventually eliminated in the near future. It's just, well, Cindy, if you keep moving. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's where we are today. And let's talk about where we're going. So this slide you see before you represents our interconnection queued capacity. The PJM interconnection queue is the process for studying resources to come onto the system. So none of the resources, the capacity totals you see here are in service today, but they are being proposed by developers to be studied by PJM. And then based off of the study results and decision of the project developer, they can advance to construction and then eventually commercial operation after signing an interconnection agreement. As the chart before you shows, the overwhelming majority, over 97% of the resources looking to interconnect into the PJM system are some combination of renewable and or storage. A lot of the numbers you see here, solar, storage, wind, these include hybrid resources. Just the way this chart was constructed shows one or the other, but a lot of the solar capacity in particular is being paired with storage as a hybrid resource. And a lot of the wind being proposed in the PJM system is actually offshore wind. This includes wind that's looking to meet the policy goals of Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey. So 3 states with fairly significant offshore wind goals, and that's going to become a major portion of the PJM resource portfolio in the coming decades. Real quick as well, related to this. So this is a very sizable number, over 200,000 megawatts of capacity that is looking to be studied. It's currently in our interconnection queue. This is higher than our current installed capacity. It's higher than our all-time peak demand in PJM. So, quite a bit of capacity that's looking to come onto the system, and we're going to see, a significant evolution of the resource portfolio in the coming years. Given the volume of resources that are looking to come onto the system, this actually presented some issues with our interconnection queue study process. Originally, as the interconnection queue process was envisioned, it was a bit of a serial process, first come, first serve, and that served us very well for a number of years. However, given the large amount of resources now looking to come onto the system, over the last couple of years, we worked with our stakeholders to Delegate Director, I'll answer your question as soon as I finish. Just making this one quick point. So the resources, the volume of resources that have been coming in the queue, we were experiencing delays in the study process. So we reformed our interconnection queue process to move from the serial nature to a first ready, first served, cluster-based study approach. So moving resources together through the queue in a more expeditious process, and then also putting more requirements on developers to demonstrate readiness and intent to build at the beginning of the queue process. So trying to reduce the amount of speculative projects in the queue and ensure that we are studying and advancing projects that really do have the intention to be constructed. And the next slide also talks a little about the interconnection queue reform process. Real quick, I'll just address the questions in the chat. So the first question, does that chart also include those projects that are not able to get in the queue or on hold until the queue clears out? So there's been a little bit of a misconception about our queue reform process, because we have been focused on addressing this backlog of resources, but we're not preventing new resources from being proposed and coming into the queue today. They're just going to get to the end of the line as part of this transition cycle as we work our way through this backlog, but they will be studied in the coming years, and we will, once we have this new process fully in place, as we make our way through these transition cycles and make our way through the backlog, this process is going to be stood up and be this continuing rolling process where there's not going to be this delay in getting projects studied as we're experiencing today. But again, we do have over 200,000 megawatts of new proposed renewable resources that are being studied today. We're working our way through that right now. The chart you see before you talks a little bit about that. So resources that have minimal network upgrades, we have this fast track process that's allowing them to effectively just skip to the end of the study process and go ahead and sign an interconnection agreement. We're working our way through those right now. And then we have some transition cycles based off of where projects are positioned in the queue. And we are going to process those over the coming years through these different transition cycles. So over the next 3 years, we're going to get through all 230,000 megawatts of proposed generation. And then from there, any new project that enters the queue today is then going to be studied, and those projects will start to move through in a much more fluid process. Okay, moving on, again, just talking a little about changes in the resource mix and trends we're seeing. The chart before you demonstrates since 2005 the historic average emissions of PJM and the trends as it relates to CO2, NOx, and SOx. As you can see, a near annual decrease in emission levels on the PJM system. In large part, this has been due to one energy transition we've already seen on the PJM system, which is the transition from coal to natural gas. Natural gas having a lower carbon output, other clean or emission policies coming into place as well that have reduced the NOx and SOx outputs for these different facilities. And then again, as we saw in the previous slide, a number of renewables coming onto the system. So, we definitely anticipate this trend to continue into the future as we replace more fossil fuel resources on the system with clean and renewable resources. Okay, go to the next slide, please. So I was asked to briefly just talk about PJM's deactivation process. This graphic you see before you has a little bit of a flow chart talking about, once a resource notifies PJM that is intending to deactivate, what that process looks like. I'll just speak to that at a high level. So if a resource announces to PJM, for every resource that announces to PJM that they are intending to deactivate, PJM initiates a study process where we will review the resource coming offline and determine if there are any reliability violations that are resulting from that resource deactivating. If there are reliability violations, the majority of the time, those violations can be addressed with upgrades in time before the resource is intending to deactivate. However, there are rare circumstances where the resource deactivating is going to present significant reliability violations. And as a result, PJM may need that resource to stick around for a little bit longer from a reliability perspective until those transmission upgrades are in place. And when that does happen, PJM offers the resource what is known as the reliability must run agreement to keep the resource in service until those upgrades are in place. The proposal and negotiation process works between PJM and the resource owner, and then has to be approved by FERC. And then from there, the resource will remain in operation until those upgrades are in place. Okay, this next slide, again, talking a little bit more about trends. Now we're going to be focusing on demand and some of the drivers of large demand growth rates over the coming years. So PJM every year produces an annual load forecast. Currently, that is 15 years out. Part of FERC Order 1920, where we're going to be moving to a 20-year planning horizon. We'll also be producing a 20-year long-term load forecast, but currently our load forecast is 15 years. This chart, it's a little bit busy, but I'll speak to it at a high level and then get into the 2024 line, which is that dotted line that reaches all the way to the top of the chart. So PJM continues to refine its load forecast process. Over the years, we've implemented energy efficiency behind the meter solar forecasts, and that helped drive a large reduction in the forecast between the 2014 and 2017 period. In 2020, we began including the EV forecasts as part of our annual load forecast. And then I'll just speak a little bit to some of the trends 2023 and 2024. So, the load forecast, the annual growth rate was relatively flat from about 2016 through about 2022. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I did want to make sure we have enough time for discussion, so maybe we can start moving things a little bit further along. And I'll just note that there's a comment that there's interest in the 1920 FERC order.
Okay, absolutely. All right, so just real quick, 10 seconds on the slide. The 2023 and 2024 load forecasts, a lot of more electrification policies being captured in the forecast. In addition to that, large amount of data centers that are being proposed in the PJM footprint. That's really driving the growth trends that we are now anticipating. Going from a relatively flat, less than 1% to about 1.7% annual growth rate over the next 15 years. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. All right, so FERC Order 1920, this was issued back in May, it's requiring all transmission providers to engage in long-term scenario-based transmission planning. So you hear this term like proactive transmission planning. This order is really driving that to implementation. PJM had been already exploring and working towards implementing a proactive long-term transmission planning mechanism with stakeholders when this order came out. So we're retooling our some aspects of our original proposal to comport with Order 1920, but we do feel that this is again going to help drive some of this proactive transmission planning that FERC is intending to have as a result from this order. So real quick, the order, again, is requiring a minimum of 3 scenarios that account for state and federal policies, including those that are driving changes in the resource mix and demand, decarbonization, anticipated deactivations, as well as other trends in fuel costs, technologies, and the like. So this order is very comprehensive, over 1,300 pages. It was issued in May and has a June 2025 compliance date. PJM is intending to initiate discussions with its stakeholders and its states as well on Order 1920 compliance later this summer and into the fall. So in the coming months, a lot more developments with us addressing the order. Overall, the order does also provide, if we go to the next slide, actually, Cindy, I'll speak to it with the slide. The order provides, a lot of engagement with the states, specifically in certain aspects. It calls out an active role for the states in the development of long-term scenario inputs, the selection criteria, as well as the cost allocation methodologies for the projects that are going to be resulting from this order. And then we also noted here just a number of other aspects of the order where the states have indicated strong interest either through their comments to FERC or engaging with PJM. So a number of different aspects of this order where the states are going to be involved as either a commenter or an active participant. I will quickly note that, for most of the order's compliance, PJM is the defined transmission provider, but with this aspect around cost allocation, it's actually the PJM transmission owners in the state that are going to be engaging on developing the cost allocation methodology. So the order uses this term transmission provider somewhat interchangeably, but there are some different roles for compliance as it relates to some of these more nuanced aspects of its implementation. Okay, last slide. All right, so for this slide, and then we have a visual representation on the next slide. FERC Order 2222. This was issued back in the year 2020, and it's intending to enable DER aggregators to participate in wholesale energy markets. So again, real-time and day-ahead energy markets, capacity markets, as well as ancillary service markets to the extent they can participate. So, this is still, we're still waiting on a FERC order to fully implement this. PJM has proposed a July 2025 implementation date for capacity market participation, and then February 2026 for the rest of the market participation. We're still waiting to hear back on a final order from FERC regarding the implementation date. The next slide just provides a little bit of a visual representation as to how Order 2222 is going to function. So we have distributed resources, the resources on the distribution system, the proposed range of capacity for these different kinds of resources that would be part of the Order 2222 model, range from 100 kilowatts as a minimum up to 5 megawatts is the maximum range. And then these resources are going to be aggregated through these participating aggregation entities, and through those aggregators then participate in the PJM markets. So it's real quick, again, it's a high level overview of how that's going to function. And then finally, last slide, I just want to quickly note that, Order 2222, 1920 are part of this larger discussion around the energy transition nationally, but also specifically within PJM. And because of this, PJM has actually crafted a specific landing page on its website to track all the different initiatives going on, both in the stakeholder process as well as studies that PJM has released as it relates to this energy transition. So I just wanted to make a quick plug for that landing page on our website. There are a lot of good resources there. If you go to just pjm.com and then follow that icon that says ensuring a reliable energy transition on the image on the bottom left. That's our homepage. That'll take you to this landing page, and there are a number of good resources there if you'd like to follow up on anything in more detail. All right, so there's my contact information. I know the presentation took a little bit of time, but Cindy, if anybody's in questions, we can dedicate a few minutes. If not, please feel free to just have folks follow up with me, and Stu and I will work on getting those questions addressed.
Thank you so much, Matthew. In the interest of time, we will be moving into discussion, and I hope you can stay with us, Matthew.
Sorry, sorry, Cindy, if I
go
might.
ahead.
And I realize we're going to be cutting short our discussion time, but I also I don't want to miss this opportunity for those on the working group to engage with both presentations, especially because much of our discussion, as we noted earlier, will be taking place over the weeks ahead of us, leading up to our next month ahead. So Cindy, go ahead and take the lead here. I know Delegate Charkoudian had questions.
Oh, thanks. I mean, if other people had, it's more comments. I was just had pointed out a couple of things in the comments, and I think as we continue to engage with PJM, you know, I appreciate them being here today and outlining this. I think there's been a lot of points where we could improve the way that PJM works with Maryland on Maryland policy and achieving Maryland policy goals. And then I just generally have concerns about things like the long-term transmission planning processes. And I just wanted to highlight, I'm very hopeful about FERC 1920. I recently joined a number of colleagues pushing PJM to embrace it and engage with it. Instead, PJM has filed a rehearing to try to get more flexibility, which means to try to do things the way they've been doing them instead of the way FERC is driving them to do them. And so I have concerns about that. I don't necessarily want to turn this into a discussion about 1920 and PJM, but I think it's very important that that, you know, as Maryland policymakers, we need to recognize this huge role that PJM plays in our ability or in blocking our ability to meet our clean energy goals, our grid goals, our ratepayer protection goals, our economic development goals. And up until this point, there's been a lot of structures at PJM that have prevented us from doing so. And so it for better or for worse, it has to be a central piece of our thinking, even though we don't control PJM, it has to be a central piece of our thinking. And we need to continue to call on PJM to, you know, work with us and to do better in all of these planning areas. And, you know, I could talk about specifics of what I think our recommendations ought to be like as part of this group that would relate to recommendations to PJM. I'm not sure if this is the time for that. And I've done a lot of talking, so I want to make sure other folks get to weigh in it as well. But I think that it can't be stressed enough how much of many of Maryland's challenges in meeting our goals are related to PJM's lack of proactive transmission planning, lack of an effective queue, and other things like that. So we really do need to keep this concept front and center because we're turning ourselves in knots trying to meet these goals, and we need to continue to do so. We need to leave it all in the field, but we also need to really be thinking about how we're engaging with PJM on these things.
Thank you.
Delegate Chuck.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback, and we certainly look forward to working with the relevant and involved Maryland state agencies through Order 1920 implementation and all these other initiatives going on as well. So
just while I have you, maybe I would ask for your commitment to work with me and MEA and PSC and OPD and others to find a way to build an alternative to RMR as well. Last session, you know, your efforts really undermined our ability to move in that direction, and I'd love your participation and collaboration on finding something that works for PJM and for Maryland instead of, you know, sort of cutting us off at the knees.
Okay, thank you. And that's noted, and we'll follow up with you regarding that.
That's great. And I do hope, just while we're talking about recommendations of this group, I think one of the recommendations of this group would be for all of our, you know, Maryland to continue our policy efforts to find ways there are alternatives to RMR that that let us get rid of coal, let us bring on storage, keep the reliability and protect ratepayers, because there's real options out there. And I think that this group, I'd love to see that be one of the recommendations. It is one that requires cooperation of PJM, but I'd love for us to include that in the recommendations of this work group.
Thank you very much. And yeah, other questions from the working group? And seeing none currently, but I also wanted to note on the 1920 point. So we have this case in front of us of Brandon Shores and Wagner. Would 1920 done anything to anticipate that?
Can I weigh in on that? Because I think that is sort of the point that I've been trying to make, is that I think that proactive transmission planning would have looked at what PJM, I'll let them say it, but what they have said to me when I've talked about it is Brandon Shores had not indicated that they were closing. In fact, they had indicated that they were going to shift to a different fuel and they were going to stay open. And so that's true. But we knew that this was a constrained zone. And so this has been a zone that Brandon Shores and Wagner have been the only providers of generation to for a very long time. So you could have looked at the zone. We had conversations in 2019 when I first joined the legislature about how constrained this zone was and how much this zone was dependent on only those two power plants. So in theory, if you had 10 years ago been doing proactive transmission planning, you would have looked at the zone and said, while we don't think that plant is retiring yet, and while that plant is not talking about retiring, that is a constrained zone. And so we ought to be long-term planning for what are the ways we bring different energy in there, either through generation or through adding transmission. And had all of that been done, we would be in a very different position right now. At the very least, we wouldn't be paying whatever Exelon asks for $800 million of transmission. We would have been able to go through a competitive process. We would have been able to consider alternatives. We would have been able to tie it to our offshore wind transmission. There's a number of different potential outcomes. Instead, we found ourselves in a crisis where the only option was to say to Exelon, build this $800 million as quickly as possible, which, by the way, I agree with. I think we have to do that now. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. We do have to do that now. But turning to Brandon Shores and saying, we're going to have ratepayers pay you $215 million a year for the next 3 to 5 years to stay online. I think all of that is avoidable had we done proactive transmission planning towards not having this as a constrained zone. And I think all of that could have put us in a stronger position once we got to the point that retirement was announced. So that's one thing that I think about 1920 and this particular retirement. And I think the other thing that is related to some extent is the queues. And I think that it's possible that we could do things with some of the new, we had new clean energy coming on and targeted in those areas, we might have fewer congestion issues. We might have fewer constraints on the grid in that area. So that's in my mind, Andrew, that's where I see the connection between this place we are in this moment in time that could have been avoided had we been doing 1920 style planning 10 years ago.
Yeah, and PJM, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as well as whether this is the distribution, there's a distribution piece of this as well in a more granular sense. But is that how you read this? Do we have a missing piece?
So,
Sure, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sorry, I almost called you Commissioner Place, the old habits. But
That's right, fair enough.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond and note as part of the Order 1920 implementation, it does require a lot of engagement with the states. We have, we have a number of different organizations at PJM or that work with PJM in the state sphere. We have the Organization of PJM States, OPSI, which is the representative of the Public Utility Commissions, and then we also have another entity called ISAC, which is comprised of a number of public utility commissions that are also OPSI members, but some additional agencies as well. These are going to be the entities that we are really going to be working with for Order 1920 scenario development. And this is going to include the inputs and assumptions that go into these different scenarios, including the policy assumptions. So I definitely recommend that the different Maryland agencies, ensure that the assumptions and discussions that we are hearing from the representatives at the PSC are reflective of some of these broader assumptions that we may not have a full awareness into across the footprint, but the states that are a little bit more closer to what's going on within their footprint bring this information to our attention and ensure that we are capturing this within our long-term transmission studies.
Yeah, on the ISAC point, that was recently sort of juiced up, wasn't it? A year or two ago.
Do you mind clarifying juiced up?
Yeah, yeah, I realized. I flew overnight, so my brain is a little casual. So ISAC existed for many years. It goes back some length of time. But and when I was on the commission, I recall that we were engaged with ISAC. But wasn't there a realization at PJM, and I'm just trying to reconnect the history, that that needed to be gain visibility or become more, have a stronger engagement? But it's sort of embedded in that question is it doesn't have it. It's only advisory, right? There is no mechanism there to drive, as Delegate Charkoudian pointed out, to obligate PJM to undertake this sort of analysis of. I'm particularly thinking of when you have executive orders from governors or even the Climate Solutions Now Act. Those are empty boxes, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. If I'm PJM, I'm scratching my head on how you could possibly write planning based on that we don't have very discrete drivers of what's going to make that change. We don't know that. I mean, and again, not to be beating the dead horse about Brandon Shores, but Delegate Charkoudion's point about that it was constrained. Everyone knew it was constrained node, but could you plan? Is it possible to plan for these uncertainties? We don't know what the economic driver is going to be for when a plant may or may not close. Is it in 2025? Is it 2030? There's dynamics in the system that will drive those changes in those dates for those changes, as well as in the sort of the more broader or in some ways more specific case of the Climate Solutions Now Act. When will increasing demand come onto the system? I mean, you have some insight on these large discrete pieces of data centers that you can see in the future, but there's how can you plan for 100,000 electric vehicles coming on in? You don't know where they're arriving into the system, or heat pumps, what that demand, when that's going to be arriving and where it's going to be arriving in the system. And that's partly why I wanted a distribution utility to be on this call today. And there's a whole host of those that are going to be driving change, and there's two parts of this. Is one, we don't have really, even in an aggregate sense or in a 30,000 foot sense, how much of this is going to be built, both on the offtake and the generation side. But even if we can know what in the aggregate is going to be arriving, so much new renewable, we don't know where it will be arriving and when with any granularity, with any clarity. So does that present an impossibility for that planning can never solve these problems?
Yeah, so thank you. It's a great set of questions, and I'll do my best to address them given the time we have. I guess circling back to the beginning of the question, about ISAC and a little bit of a reformation going on there. So ISAC did recently, in the last year or two, reform its charter. It's just a little bit more better define its role within providing transmission planning assumptions to PJM. And through that, they developed, in collaboration with us, state policy workbook, which is going to be tracking all these different policies that can be used as inputs for transmission planning initiatives, including Order 1920. This includes RPS targets, broader clean energy goals, proactive deactivations that should be considered, and the policies and drivers behind those, because if they're not being officially announced to PJM, we still have an ability to get that information, but it is a collaborative process, and states do provide inputs in confirming what those resources may be that should be considered as an assumption within a planning driver. So a lot of good work went into developing that workbook. It's last year was the first year we really had anything developed with that, but it's going to be an expanding process as this transmission planning framework continues to evolve, and we assume that this will also be a foundational component to Order 1920 assumptions. You also mentioned some of the policies that may be a little bit more broad in nature and how they're defined. We do work with, or we have an opportunity within our load forecasting process. And within that workbook, the states also can submit electrification policies for us to consider. If they're a little bit more broad in nature, we may need some more definition from the states to the extent it's available on how those policies will be implemented, to the extent that we can replicate that in our modeling. With that said, though, we did incorporate some state policies as it relates to electrification for buildings, water heaters, and water pumps. Within our load forecast this year, New Jersey provided some of that information for policies within their state that we're able to capture in our load forecast. And then we also received a number of policies to consider for load forecast sensitivities in this long-term planning dynamic. So it's a continuing process. Last year was the first year we really had a lot of policy engagement with the load forecasting process. We expect it to continue. We've got a framework in place working with our states, but again, it's going to require a collaboration and inputs coming from them. ISAC, individual states want to participate in our transition planning process to help us get a little bit more of these discrete and nuanced aspects of the assumptions that are going to this planning process. Harking back to our proposed long-term process that we were stakeholders on before Order 1920 was initiated, we were envisioning a longer series of assumptions meetings for the long-term planning process than we have in our near-term RTEP. So, I envision that as we work towards compliance on Order 1920, this is going to be a very engaging series of assumptions meetings to help define the different scenarios that go into long-term planning. And again, we're hopeful that the states will be active participants within that process.
Thank you. Yeah, and I realized we're getting close to the bottom of the hour. As far as the public comment, we can keep this meeting open after the 10:30. I will certainly stay online, so we're not going to cut short the 5 minutes we've devoted for public comment. We did segue into the discussion. Essentially what we've done in the last 10 minutes here is cover the discussion points that you would have noted were on the PowerPoint slide that Cindy had put before us. In some ways in closing, but other work groups members, please jump in and we can keep this going somewhat past the bottom of the hour. But
John, I'm sorry, Andrew. I
Yeah.
did have to drop off in a few minutes. I have another meeting that I need to prepare for. So
Yeah.
it does look like we received one final comment in case we wanted to take that on for public comment.
All right. Yeah, and just in closing for 10 seconds here, but just to note, and for being in my head or in others' head, is even when you have this planning process, and it's much more granular than it was in our grandparents' days, but out of the planning process, you have to have something that's actionable. and maybe as a former commissioner, this scares the daylights out of me. But can we live in a world in which we are building with the anticipation of these changes that may or may not occur? And the Brandon Shores case is a case in point. Could we have built in the resiliency? And I'm not trying to see the waters here, but could we have acted? Could we have built new wires or whatever else into the system, and anticipated that closure that may or may not have happened, or may have happened in different years? So that, in some ways, it's what keeps me awake at night, even with the all we're adding on, the bells and whistles we're adding onto the planning process. But I don't want to dominate here. Delegate Shakudin, do you like to add anything else, or you're fine? Anyone else in the work group want to add anything in before we close?
I'm good, thanks.
Chair, I have a question. This is Katie Hester.
All right, Senator.
Thank you. I mean, I was just curious while PJM is on the phone. I mean, it seems like this FERC order is so incredibly important, and they're asking for more flexibility. And I just kind of want to know why that flexibility is necessary, given the importance of this order, and whether it's just PJM or like all the other RTAs are asking for flexibility. I just think it's super important, and I'd like to hear their response.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, the intent behind some of the flexibility components of the request for a hearing clarification, you know, I think, you know, we had a very comprehensive framework in place that we were proposing as part of our long-term planning process, that we felt was, you know, somewhat a little bit more reflective of the unique dynamics of PJM. So you know, we were requesting to see what kind of flexibility would be afforded as it related to the original proposal for long-term planning. I will note, though, that yesterday, by order of law, FERC denied the rehearing requests as well. So we'll see what the next steps are coming out of that. But some of the flexibility that was requested by PJM was denied at this time.
Thanks for the update.
Thank you. Yes, we're at the, sorry, but we're at the bottom of the hour, or we're 2 minutes past the bottom of the hour. We have 5 minutes set aside here for public comment. If work group people, members need to drop, I certainly understand. All of the questions we get from, or the comments we get from the public, will be recorded and included in the web presence for this working group. So they will be noted. Anyone from the public who would like to jump in at this point, please raise your hand and I will recognize you.
Jeff?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Fine, thank you. Basically, thank you for the opportunity. I'll be brief. I only emphasize that energy storage must use renewable energy as its charging source to promote and hasten the payback of the climate beneficial grid design and generation projects. Storage of fossil fuel source power, because it has the most profits for the investor-owned utilities, is counterproductive to Maryland's Climate Solutions Now Act goals. Thank you for your time and your attention. Bye now.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Others? All right. Hearing none, I will bring this meeting to a close. Look forward to seeing everyone in the month ahead and all the work we have in the interim. Appreciate it. And thank you also for all the presentations we have today.
Thank you so much, everyone.